Welcome everyone to Catalista's 2 Minutes to Midnight. People get ready. My name is Henry Coleman, coming to you from the studios at Catalista Centrale. "2 Minutes to Midnight, People Get Ready" is a deep dive into how the world works. In Season 1, we explore a book that connects the dots between accelerating computing power, capitalism, and democracy. It's called People Get Ready: The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy by Robert McChesney and John Nichols. On this episode, we head into the maelstrom. That's the title of Chapter 1 of People Get Ready. Our guests are Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor Daniel Broudy, and author Dan McQuillan. We'll hear about CEOs who talk about job loss as creative destruction and what we can do to nurture a humane future. Professor Noam Chomsky is a linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, social critic, and political activist. He's a laureate professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona and an institute professor emeritus at MIT. Professor Chomsky has written more than 150 books on topics that include linguistics, war, politics, and mass media. Professor Daniel Broudy has lived in Japan since 1995 and has been on the faculty of Okinawa Christian University since 2005. As an author, editor, and scholar, Dan integrates research in cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and linguistics to analyze big tech and data, threats to human agency, autonomy, and sovereignty. Let's begin with you, Professor Chomsky. Former head of Google, Eric Schmidt, said in a speech that more and more middle-class workers will lose their jobs due to automation, with no jobs on the horizon to replace them. Some CEOs call this elimination of workers creative destruction, which is another way to say get rid of workers and increase profits. If corporate leaders know all about the possibility of massive job loss and so-called creative destruction, Professor Chomsky, what do you think they have in mind for the future of society and working people?
Well, first of all, just a matter of fact, then we'll get to the question you asked. The matter of fact is that there's a huge need for workers. There's no shortage of jobs. There's no indication that automation has had a greater impact than technological change in the past. Just walk around any city where you are or any countryside. Masses of work that has to be done. The infrastructure's collapsing, construction's needed, teachers are needed, researchers are needed. Immense amount of work that has to be done. If it's not being done, that's because of a societal dysfunction, not because of automation, at least anything now or in the horizon. But suppose it were true, then let's get back to your question. What are corporate leaders after? Profit, period. Take much more serious cases than this. Let's take a look at Glasgow. Glasgow's determining, literally, whether the human species can survive. The results provided by the IPCC are quite unambiguous, much clearer, more direct than before. Notice this is a consensus report, overwhelming consensus of scientists. Either we stop using fossil fuels right now, beginning with a small reduction annually each year till we hit the IPCC targets, or else we're doomed. So how are the corporate leaders reacting? With euphoria. Read the business journals. They're delighted. They're opening up new fields to exploit. Profits are booming. Coal operators were practically bankrupt a couple of years ago, and now their stock is shooting up. It's a marvelous world. We can gain more short-term profit tomorrow and ensure that our grandchildren won't have a world to live in. That's called capitalism. That's nothing to do with automation. Actually, Adam Smith talked about it. He said the masters of mankind are British, in his day, British manufacturers and merchants. They're the masters of mankind. And they pursue their vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. Well, that's Adam Smith. It's a little harsh, but pretty good picture of the way the system works. So when the system works as it's supposed to, shouldn't be surprised. You're not going to hear this from Eric Schmidt, I suspect, but you can hear it from Adam Smith, and you can see it right in front of you. So the answer to your question is, if corporate leaders, including Eric Schmidt, can make more money by getting rid of workers, they'll do it. It isn't a rising. Actually, it is a rising in a certain sense. That we're now in a period of what amounts to a mass general strike, withholding of labor. Working people are simply refusing to return to the rotten, low-paying, dangerous jobs that have been imposed on them in 40 years of neoliberalism. They're saying, enough, I'm not going to do it. Now, profits are booming. It's not a matter of luck of profits. But corporate leaders, other business owners, are not willing to raise wages sufficiently to attract workers because they're doing fine with profits booming, federal subsidies, and so on. It's right in front of our eyes. We don't have to fantasize about what might happen in some future world where there's no jobs.
Same question for you, Dan Broudy. Would you refer to the elimination of workers as creative destruction?
I don't think any of us should be surprised by this somewhat slowly unfolding situation. Over the past number of decades, we've been prepared by corporate media to kind of take on board the idea that our livelihoods are going away, they're fading away. And I read some years ago that the Fed, in fact, lives by the old adage that workers must be put in a perpetual state of disruption. So the market system we live in and are conditioned from cradle to grave to accept as normal, or at least acceptable, demands ever-increasing forms of speed and efficiency in production and also with us, human beings. And of course, we can only be pushed so far physically. So more and more machines are now necessary. And I think this is why we're being conditioned to accept the imposition of machinery integrated into biology, into our physical bodies, into our flesh. We've got to listen to the owners of the means of production and constantly enhance or upgrade ourselves physically, cognitively, to essentially shut up and receive the routine injectable updates for our right now defiled biological state. Proponents pushing the fourth industrial revolution paint for us a picture of the future in which we'll conduct our lives and relationships in the so-called metaverse or its equivalent. And, we're told that distinctions between our offline and online worlds will likely blur, and our notions of empirical reality itself will fade away. And I think this hints at their intentions to park us in a kind of matrix-like new world. I read somewhere that Schmidt predicted that by 2023, AI will surpass the intelligence of humans. And I think it's important to question, is there any wonder why transhumanist talking heads want to hook our brains up to the global neural network with their new brain chip implants? So what's in store for the masses, ill-equipped, untrained, unwilling to serve the demands of the new digital economy? In my opinion, it's either a new kind of serfdom or a complete liberation. I can recall the 2018 World Economic Forum in Davos, Yuval Harari, when he was talking about the new digital age. And he was talking about digital dictatorships, which is very interesting. In 2018, at least it was very interesting to me. And he was talking about the 21st century, and there's a really big struggle will be up against. And that is the struggle against irrelevance. And he was talking about how those who fail in this struggle against irrelevance will constitute a kind of new zero class, or I think he said useless class or something like that. And of course, this presupposes that people will remain comfortably numb in their high-tech induced comas. If you shift your focus, though, just a bit away from the mainstream media, you can easily see millions and millions of people around the world in the streets with their so-called torches and pitchforks. So it seems to me that Harari's prediction of 2018 doesn't appear to be coming to pass. It seems to me a lot of people, many people around the world are fearlessly out in the streets challenging this, what's presented as an inevitable paradigm shift. I think there is definitely some hope.
I think what you said just now about the need to look beyond the mainstream media to actually see what's going on around the world is vital. And we need also look at what's happening on the ground around us. Initiatives where people are moving in a very different direction, taking food production, education, the economy, and even politics into their own hands. I think we do need to take these initiatives more seriously, because even if they're small, they're happening on a much wider scale than the mainstream media would have us believe. Still, the dominant system is a capitalist one, and alternatives are struggling in an uphill battle. Computing power is increasing exponentially, and as People Get Ready puts it, we're heading into a maelstrom where technology can be used for surveillance, propaganda, and control as much as for liberation. How does capitalism sway this story, do you think?
So I would say that capitalism is the story, but it is a particular strain, that which is practiced untethered to any critical thought or moral sense about the effect that commodification and the marketization of nature itself will have on human flourishing. I don't think capitalism is really the central problem, so much as it is a particular practice. Capitalism is a means of value substitution, a private exchange of tokens for goods. But in the neoliberal stage of capitalism, where profit is the only value and wealth justifies all by logical extension, life and human beings ultimately become worthless to the system when their profit value decreases. At least over the past 5 years, we're seeing highly sophisticated greenwashing propaganda, astroturfing campaigns, selling us all the idea that the system of perpetual consumption, which has actually brought us to this point in history, social and environmental breakdown, can amend itself, fix its ways. The adulterated and plundered biosphere. And it claims it can also fix us too. Liberation from this kind of matrix, I think, begins with the liberation of the mind, that the system of free and private exchange must be surveilled by the owners of capital reproduction. Transnational finance and banking, we can see today, are moving most of the world toward a fully surveilled market where participants like you and me are granted privilege and access if we qualify for it socially. Hence the claimed beauty, or the veiled claim, of the Chinese system of social credit. We should be reminded that we are now taught to confuse and conflate concepts of social justice with social credit. So I think if we are fully compliant and obedient and keen to hand over our privacy and agency and autonomy to be ruled as serfs, then the chips they're embedding in material and organic matter, such as livestock, pets, and now human bodies, in the flesh, we can remain active in this new system. Of course, it's fascinating and deeply troubling to see this process unfold, to see how the social experiment proceeds from what appears to be, in my research, plans that have been laid long ago. And we can see now in the States, leaders seeking to criminalize the questioning of authority. Just a quick point about that. In Japan, where I've been for almost 30 years, such a move would likely be met with mockery and public ridicule. Japanese do not suffer hypocrites long. No politician would survive a call to criminalize forms of discourse that question authority.
Dan McQuillan is a lecturer in creative and social computing at Goldsmiths, University of London. He has collaborated with Amnesty International and took to the streets in Genoa in 2001 to protest the G8, calling for an alternative to globalization that included justice for both people and planet. Dan is the author of Resisting AI, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence. Dan McQuillan, what are a few of your thoughts on the relationship between technology and capitalism?
It's great to be having a conversation about what I'd call technopolitics, because it seems like a really urgent part of all of the big questions of our time right now. On that specific thing, I think I'd like to kind of push back on the question a little bit, in the sense that I think in the question there are a couple of positions that I wouldn't personally adopt. And one is the idea of almost positioning capitalism and technology as having any distinction in a way under current conditions. So my first point really would be that the technology that we have, yes, it's definitely accelerating, and I spend a lot of time looking at artificial intelligence. So it's definitely exponentially accelerating in some sense, but it is in fact a product of the system that we have, not only capitalism, but the general worldviews that we inhabit. This is what our technology sediments, what it materializes. So it's in no way separate from the other major forces in our societies, like very significantly and specifically capitalism. And the second thing is just as well the idea that, and this may be to clarify what I mean, the idea that it can be this as much as that it can be definitely bad as much as it can be good, or vice versa. I wouldn't say the framing I'm trying to promote is deterministic. I'm not just saying, all technology is just capitalist and therefore it's bad and we must throw it away and start from scratch. But what I am saying is that it's a product of the same conditions, the same visions, and the same material relations. And so it very heavily embodies that. It's very heavily weighted towards that. For me specifically, when I'm writing or thinking about AI, that's a kind of extreme case. With AI specifically, it is so extremely weighted towards the first set of things, the more, unfortunately, sort of exploitative, repressive aspects, that I think actually with that specific kind of technology, it's basically, I would say, more or less impossible to do anything very progressive with it. With other technologies, the balance will be different. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that really the technologies and the systems that we have are not separate. They're all part of the same package. Of course, there are plural possibilities, but we have to start from a position of saying the actual specific technologies we have right now have been produced in, with, and for a certain way of life, a certain world. And if we want a different one, we have to take that into account. I think where I have got to with my narrative about AI really is having gone into AI with probably a set of aspirations that are somewhat similar to that I think is expressed by some of your questions, hoping that there's an AI for good and there's an AI for the people. With this specific technology, having got to a point of thinking, actually, because what it really embeds very much is a sort of reductive instrumentalism whose whole operations internally, now I'm talking about the algorithms, is very much based only, all it does really is create the boundaries of division and exclusion. That is really the only thing that AI is capable of doing. It's not actually a productive technology in any way. So it embeds inside its very operations a kind of binarizing, divisive worldview whose operations inevitably sort of rank things and people in terms of matters of worth, really, who is worth preserving, who is not worth preserving. So my starting point really was, or is very much still, to try and highlight these aspects of the technology and call for alternatives. One of the invisibly powerful transformative effects of current AI, and by which I'm drawing a fairly broad brush here because I'm also including forms of machine learning. But so when I'm talking about AI, I'm specifically talking about basically neural networks and so-called deep learning. That's really deep learning. And deep learning is a subset of machine learning. So a lot of these advanced systems are still working their way towards real-world implementation, which is why I feel this is a good time to raise the alarm. But for those systems that are out there, one of the most transformative ways that they're currently being applied is, for example, in welfare systems. Because this fits from a state point of view, this is a sort of urgent requirement for this kind of technology, for a sort of automatized. It's not so much automation, I don't think. I wouldn't actually see automation as the biggest danger. What I'd see as the biggest danger is automatization. So automatization, by which I'm meaning arrangements of people and technology within which the people's capacity to think for themselves, to object when necessary, to come to an independent conclusion about what needs to be done are sort of progressively removed. So, I mean, we're already all a bit automatized by the world that we live in. But I think these technologies, that's the effect that they have. So if we take very concrete example, a system that has been applied in the Netherlands and is still being applied, called SIRI, which stands for something like System Risk Indication, I think. So this system is intended, it would be developed on the basis of the same paradigms that these systems are all sold on. The idea of being able to optimize at scale for efficiency and effectiveness. What actually happens, of course, because we're talking about these kind of systems being inseparable from the world that they're applied in, is those systems are used to target and discriminate poor communities of color. I mean, to the extent that Syria's initial operations a couple of years ago were actually found to be illegal, even by inside the Dutch legal system itself. Although it's now come back in a slightly modified form, of course, because this stuff isn't so easy to stop. So when I'm talking about the eliminationist tendencies of AI, I am talking in some way an abstract tendency which I am arguing will play out in many, many different ways. But what I'm also talking about are actually concrete examples where real people are, in this case, for example, having so-called fraud checkers literally kicking their front door down, going through their laundry, invading their privacy on the basis of what an algorithm has told them. So we're facing a situation where the decisions about those kind of activities, were always present as a possibility within the bureaucratic systems, which are already quite cruel, which control the living conditions for most people who, you could say marginalized, but actually includes many more people than are not marginalized. Those systems already have a capacity for a systemic cruelty. But what we have with algorithms is and particularly with machine learning, is a massive potential for that to intensify. So I'm trying to draw the resonances between very concrete instances of that and saying this is not, a bad apple, a single instance, a misplaced application. This is very much predicated on what this technology does, what people who are applying it and commissioning it and developing it, it's what they hope for. They might not think of it that way, but it's because it is developed with these particular values, and it's because it does this particular thing. It is this kind of hammer. That's what it does, and it's going to do that. And if you put that in the conditions of our current crisis, you think, well, what does that mean in situations where we're going to have increasing movements of displaced people because of the climate crisis, where the financial crisis is laid over with the pandemic, and so on and so forth? Then these kind of sharply violent algorithmic activities are going to become, unfortunately, far more widespread.
Wow. Thanks, Dan. And thank you also for picking up on some of the assumptions in the question and really expressing just how enmeshed technology is with economic pressures. And I think that leads nicely into our next question. Throughout the world, taxation, the legal system, education, housing, pretty much everything favors the 0.1%. The authors of People Get Ready cite such favoritism as an essential element of a citizenless democracy. Professor Chomsky, is the United States a citizenless democracy?
The standard term for it is class war. We have been subjected to about 40 years since Reagan of bitter, one-sided class war. The neoliberal systems were designed to have the effect that you just described. It was obvious at the beginning. Take Reagan's inaugural address. Core phrase was, government is the problem, not the solution. Well, what does that mean? Decisions are made somewhere. If they're not made in government, they're made somewhere else. Where's the somewhere else? It's in concentrations of unaccountable private power. Government, from the Reaganite point of view, has a flaw. It's partially influenced by population. It's partially accountable to them. Got to get rid of that. Have to shift decision-making to unaccountable private tyrannies that follow Adam Smith's vile maxim. And that was hammered home by the economic guru of the Reagan administration and subsequent ones, Milton Friedman, who had written a famous article in which he stated that the sole responsibility of a corporation is to maximize profit, which of course means maximize pay for managers and CEOs and so on. Incorporation is in fact a gift given by the public. It confers many advantages. If you don't want a gift, you don't have to incorporate. You can stay a partnership. But according to the Friedman-Reagan neoliberal doctrine, corporations can accept the gift, but it comes with no responsibility. They're just out for themselves. That's a moral imperative, Friedman argued. Well, put all this together. Transfer decision-making to unaccountable private tyrannies whose sole responsibility is to maximize wealth for themselves. That's Adam Smith's vile maxim. It is a surprise what happened. It's completely predictable. And there's even measures of what has happened. So, for example, the Rand Corporation, ultra respectable, a couple of months ago, did an estimate of what they politely call transfer of wealth, what we should call robbery. Transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class to the very rich, from the lower 90% of income to what in fact is a fraction of 1% if we look closely. Their estimate is almost $50 trillion in the last 40 years, which is a significant underestimate. Doesn't include other measures that were made available when Reagan opened the spigot for mass robbery, tax havens, cutting back the Internal Revenue Service so it won't find rich tax cheats and so on. It's right in front of our eyes now. We'll take a look at what's happening in Congress. The Trump administration had one legislative achievement, one, a tax bill, which was a massive transfer of wealth to the very rich in the corporate sector at a cost of roughly $2 trillion, which by charming coincidence is exactly about the sum that Biden's reconciliation bill has been cut down to by 100% Republican opposition and with support from far right-wing Democrats, punched a huge hole in the deficit under Trump. But that was not a problem because it was gifts for the rich. Now it's attacked as a huge deficit problem because it's things that are being done for working people and the poor. That's the vile maxim in operation, right in front of our eyes, on the floors of Congress today. We don't have to look far to see it. To some extent, this has been true all over the world as the neoliberal assault extended worldwide under the influence of mainly the United States, also its close ally, client, Britain. And notice that Reagan and Thatcher, or their advisors, understood exactly what they were doing. They realized that it was imperative in order for these policies to succeed, this mass highway robbery, it's imperative to eliminate any defense. So their first acts, first ones, were to smash unions, the one means of defense that working people have. Corporate sector, of course, joined in happily, joined them in the measures of strike breaking, like hiring scabs, and the result has been a very serious decline in the capacity of working people and, of course, the poor to defend themselves. So yes, you end up with mass highway robbery. radical inequality written into the very policies. Incidentally, if we are interested in a little history, we might look back at the origins of neoliberalism. Where's it come from? Neoliberalism was developed in Vienna in the interwar period, the 1920s. The leading figure, Ludwig von Mises, he's the guru, the revered saint of the movement. Friedrich Hayek was there, Lionel Robbins from England, others. That's the core of what they called neoliberalism. It was bitterly anti-labor. Von Mises himself could barely contain his euphoria when the proto-fascist Austrian state violently destroyed the labor movement and social democracy. In fact, if you look at his major book on liberty, 1927, he hails fascism as a tremendous gift to civilization. The fascists, he says, will go down in history for liberating the society. He's, of course, referring not to Hitler, that was later, but to Mussolini, who had destroyed the labor movement, killed independent thought, smashed civil society, but allowed sound economics to flourish. Sound economics means market principles designed so that they will benefit the super rich and crush everyone else. That's the guru of neoliberalism. It's no wonder that the neoliberals flocked to Pinochet's Chile. Vicious, brutal dictatorship killed thousands of people, placed the society under iron control, wiped out the labor movement, enormous gifts to the rich. The Chicago boys flocked there. Hayek said he had never seen such freedom in his life. Yes, that's natural. Actually, they managed to crash the economy in about 5 years, but that's kind of forgotten. Then they moved to bigger game, the world, the neoliberal assault. And it's had the quite predictable effects that you mentioned. Nothing to be surprised about. In fact, we can go back to Adam Smith again. Smith pointed out that the masters of mankind, merchants and manufacturers of England, will not only pursue their vile maxim, but they will also be sure that they are the principal architects of government policy. They will use their wealth and power to dominate governments. And they will make sure that their own interests, I'm now quoting, are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England. It's not a surprise. It's built into the system, recognized in the very early stages by Adam Smith, happening right before our eyes as we speak. No mysteries.
Yeah, that reminds me of episode 1 of 2M2M, where the authors of People Get Ready explained how the ideologies of the powerful allow them to go on believing that their actions somehow benefit all of us. And I'd add that in a globalized economy, they're so far removed from real people and real ecosystems that they can uphold these delusions while working to protect their profits. Dan Broudy, we live at a time when nuclear weapons can end all life, and disrespect for the environment is considered the cost of doing business. In the face of this quote-unquote realism, what are the chances of a humane response to the radical technological change that's currently unfolding?
I agree with Harari in his 2018 speech. Actually, it wasn't a public speech. I think it was during the 2018 conference that he made a really interesting point. It was humble, and it makes perfect sense. We can't know. We can't possibly know with absolute certainty, but I think the chances are very good if we can become more conscious of the systems in place that are hemming us in, winding us up emotionally, framing our thinking, clouding our better judgment, and nudging us each day to accept as reasonable or inevitable, the forms of dispossession that are unfolding before us. I think over the past few decades, the trends seem dire. They seem quite bleak, even horrifying, but one can never know when small acts of love and kindness, resistance to tyranny, can precipitate a kind of global revolution in thought and behavior. I think that goes for the oppressed as well as the oppressors. So I'd like to remain optimistic that people in power can have a change of heart and work to build a truly equitable world.
Thank you for that. I think it's so important. And same question for you, Dan McQuillan. What are our chances for a humane future?
I definitely agree with the need for radical humane alternatives to current directions of travel, including current technological changes. My position on this is very much connected to my answer about the inseparability of the technology and the system. I mean, nuclear power and nuclear weapons are a good example, of, as Langdon Winner pretty well laid out, of how much technology and societies shape each other. What I would see really is not so much having to take a technology that's autonomously developing and provide it with a sort of humane addition or a humane shaping. I think rather, because the technologies are such a product of the system that we're trying to reorient, that we need to push in a different direction, I would say that actually the question of how do we resist those technologies is very similar to and overlaps very heavily with how do we resist most of the other very harmful, inhumane, violent, and frankly murderous developments, planet depleting activities that are happening all over. What I'm trying to say is that the technological acceleration that we're seeing is very much in line with and resonant with most of the other things that we would also see as being inhumane, harmful, whether you think that's tyrannical or fascistic political developments or with the climate crisis. These things are part of a conjoined set of developments, and understanding, if we're starting with technology, understanding how to start resisting a certain kind of technological imposition brings one, I think, to a similar point to how to resist various of these others. In fact, it's not really a separate question. So for me, for example, when I'm writing specifically about AI, I'm writing about how to resist AI, and I'm writing about how to resist AI in a way that is prefigurative of an alternative way of doing things. That means not just an alternative technology, but an alternative way of living, really, an alternative way of relating. And so, of course, that's very overlapping with the question of how do we oppose extractivism and the, petro power? How do we oppose, politically far right developments? All of these things overlap, and but the good thing in some way is that they all have a relatively mutually supporting set of responses, which in fact pivot quite a lot on ideas like mutuality, like mutual aid and solidarity and return of the commons and so forth. These are also answers to the technological issues as much as they are to any other social and political issue right now.
Yeah, I like that. In a way, resistance and radical imagination feed into one another. They can be part of the same process. Professor Chomsky, would you tell us what you envision when you hear the term democratic economy?
I envision that every member, every participant in an enterprise will have an equal voice in determining let's say, a workplace, how the work is distributed, how it's divided, what the factory is doing. They will participate in it. That's a democratic workplace. Same if it's a university, a hospital, whatever it may be. And it should be, in a decent society, integrated with democratically run communities, not communities run by vast amounts of private capital, which, especially since Citizens United, which vastly expanded dark money and private funding, PACs, super PACs, and so on, not run by those who hoard the wealth of the society, but rather by the population themselves. That would be a democratic society, what working people and radical farmers back in the 19th century called a cooperative commonwealth, something which recognizes the rights of people as free citizens.
Environmental issues, poverty, housing, every type of advocacy is restrained by big money. Dan McQuillan, how important is it for activists to include a democratic approach to the economy as part of their missions?
Absolutely. The question of democracy is at the heart of every concern that we might have about human well-being and environmental well-being. And I think the question really is what do we mean by democracy? And again, I would say that our extant ideas of democracy are themselves, again, in a way, a form of technology, you could say. And they're a form of technology, a form of technics, which includes certain things we actually think of as technology, but they're a form of arrangement, of assembling things that's very specific and very much, again, a product of the same set of dynamics that has produced neoliberalism and other dominant world systems. So yes, absolutely, we need democracy. Yes, we need a democratic control, a democratized means of social reproduction. We need a democratized economic activity. But we also need to think about what we mean by democracy. And so I can give you a very specific example in terms of the area that I tend to focus on, which is artificial intelligence and advanced computation, which is that they are very heavily predicated on a worldview that believes that representationalism is a superior way of ordering the world. In other words, if you can create a representation of something, it's then something that first off has a veracity that allows a sort of insight and manipulation. And this, I think, resonates very strongly with our concept that somehow, a representational democratic system is the highest form of social ordering. And I'd suggest, actually, there are many other kinds of democracy, and I'm not pushing one kind of democracy. What I think is great right now is there are experiments with other kinds of democracies, small, struggling experiments, but there are those experiments in the real world, around the world, and more direct forms of democracy are likely to be resonant with, in my opinion, possibilities for actually achieving some real change and actually also creating conditions to produce technology that supports that change.
Dan, you talked about mutuality. And you mentioned experiments with democracy. Would you share an example?
I think a very vivid experiment in alternative ways of organizing at the moment would be something like the autonomous administration in northeast Syria, which is usually known as Rojava, where there's experiments in what's known as democratic confederalism. Now, I'm not trying to promote that as a sort of one-size-fits-all answer. What I'm trying to say there is that that's on a visible social scale, at scale, to some extent, or at federated scale, you might say, people trying to be more participatory, direct, and bottom up with their decision making and their governance of their societies, including their economic activity. If in my field, if you like, there are some historical examples of how technology can be developed in a similar way. I mean, a really great one is actually from the UK, from the 1970s, where there was a massive arms company at that time called Lucas Aerospace, and the workers in that company, under the influence of various things that were going on at the time, including economic stress, but also including what was the emergence of things like the environmental movement and the feminist movement and so on and so forth. It was a very dynamic time. But the ordinary workers in that company, who were actually quite skilled, I mean, most of them were engineers of some kind or another, decided to collectively from the bottom up create a plan for the transformation of the company and of what the company produced to make it democratically controlled by the workers themselves, but also to produce things like hybrid electric vehicles, early solar power. I mean, this is the 1970s, so they were way ahead. So I'm trying to draw a parallel there between a sort of general approach to democracy, which is one of horizontalism and direct democracy, based around assemblies of various kinds, and also because my focus is on how technopolitics comes into all of this, how the technology politics comes into all of this. I'm also trying to motivate the idea that this can be applicable to, developing forms of technology, techniques that can be mutually supporting with the idea of more direct democracy, more control over social reproduction.
What does it mean to have more control over social reproduction?
social reproduction is simply meaning like everything. So it isn't just restricted to workplaces. It also includes, the conditions through which our communities are reproduced in everyday life. So it would include things like childcare, all of those invisibilized labors so social reproduction is like all of the stuff that happens so that production can happen, so that work can happen, so that people can go around the world being, successful and highly paid cryptocurrency traders or whatever it is, because they're relying on a huge amount of unpaid, mostly invisible daily activity that goes into supporting everything else. And that's that's often the real work that supports society. And that stuff can be socialized, can be collectivized, and can be collectively governed, I think.
Professor Chomsky, should all activists put the fight for democracy, economic as well as political, at the center of their missions?
It's a tricky question. In principle, the answer is yes. But there are some facts that we cannot overlook. We happen to be living at a unique moment in human history. We are facing a point where either we will control the environmental catastrophe quickly, or we're doomed. We're marching towards a precipice, step by step. If we fall over it, we're finished. The precipice is tipping points that we are approaching on environmental catastrophe. The energy corporations want to race to it as fast as possible. The Republican organization, I hate to call them a party because they abandoned the norms of parliamentary politics a long time ago, but the Republican organization owned by Trump is 100% dedicated to racing to the precipice as quickly as possible. The right-wing Democrats, like Joe Manchin, the leading coal baron, leading recipient of fossil fuel funding in Congress, he agrees. His slogan, as he said, is taken straight out of the ExxonMobil playbook. No elimination, period. No elimination of fossil fuels, just innovation. Maybe we can someday figure out some way to remove from the atmosphere the poisons we have to pour in. Well, that's playing out right. The United States is not alone on this. One of the worst, but it's not alone. European countries are calling for increasing oil production right now, right after they have heard from the IPCC that we must reduce oil production and fossil fuel production immediately. So there's plenty of guilt to go around. But the point is, the time span available for dealing with this crisis is short. If we don't deal with it within the next decade or two, we're over the precipice. That doesn't mean that everyone dies at once. It just means that we go into an era of decline, of disaster after disaster, escalating moral collapse as people try to save whatever they can for themselves. Indescribable horror. Could go on for centuries. It wouldn't even be worth living in. The lucky people are those who die. We're heading for that unless we solve the problem quickly. And we know how to do it. There are clear programs, perfectly feasible, well understood, coming from leading economists like my colleague and friend Robert Pollin, Jeffrey Sachs, International Energy Agency, all about the same. Perfectly feasible, can grasp the opportunities. If we don't, we're over the precipice. Now, going back to your question, yes, we should emphasize social change in the direction of democracy, freedom, the ideals that classical liberals pursued before it was destroyed by modern industrial capitalism, John Stuart Mill, Humboldt, others, Adam Smith. Yes, we should, but the time scale is different. We can press for them now, but we can't achieve them now. We can't achieve them on the time scale required to deal with this crisis by the means available. So we have a desperate situation in which we must meet the imminent crisis basically within the framework of existing institutions, while at the same time working on the more long-range project of creating a democratic, free, and just society. Those are the realities we have to face.
Wow. So I see there are these different horizons we collectively have to work towards. But maybe particular campaigns can't afford to be concerned with the horizons further down the track. An interesting idea. Another question for you, Noam, about journalism. Journalists today are under various levels of pressure to self-censor. In some places, there's the real threat of being shut down by government intervention, and in other places, they're groomed to act as mouthpieces for a corporate point of view. What can be done to jumpstart and nourish a journalism that supports democratic society?
Now, there's actually very good work on this to which I couldn't direct your attention. Robert McChesney and his associates, Victor Picard and others, have laid out some very sensible programs for reviving and recreating journalism. Notice that journalism has been virtually destroyed in the United States, not by government intervention, rather by normal class war. There used to be rich and vibrant local journalism. I lived in Boston most of my life. The Boston Globe used to be a fine newspaper, very good journalism, great journalists, some of them close personal friends, bureaus all over the world, some of the best reporting in the country on, say, things like the Central American horrors in the 1980s. Now, if you look at the Boston Globe, it's local news and wire services, okay? That's happening all over the country. San Francisco Chronicle, Chicago Tribune, Minneapolis Star Tribune, all over. Local journalism has virtually disappeared. That's a major attack on democracy. It means that people don't even know what's going on in their local communities, nor in the government. The local newspapers used to have Washington bureaus observing what's happening in the federal government. All that's left is the Washington Post, which covers national news, and the New York Times, covering international news. Both of them pretty sharply cut back by the class war, which has concentrated wealth and distributed it to the rich and powerful. First move to resuscitate journalism is to recreate local journalism, rebuild it. That's the basis for functioning democracy. How can that be done? Well, here we might go back to the revered founding fathers who we're supposed to worship but not pay attention to, like in other religions. So you're supposed to worship the founding fathers but not look at what they said. Worship the Constitution as a gift from God, but not look at it. If you look at it, you notice that one of the articles of the Constitution establishes the post office. What did the post office mean in the 1780s and 90s? It meant government subsidy for a free press. About 80% of post office business was virtually free delivery of newspapers and journals. The founding fathers believed that a vibrant, lively, independent free press was essential for a functioning democracy, and it therefore was a public good that the public should support by essentially public subsidy, free delivery, and so on. That's the post office. Now, the reactionaries who run the country have been trying for years to destroy the post office, defunding it, imposing burdens on it that no private business could ever meet, like advance funding for pensions and so on, preventing it from doing things that would allow it to compete successfully against private carriers. The vile maxim requires that you support private enterprise. In other words, bitterly attacking the Constitution and the will of the founding fathers. Meanwhile, holding up the Constitution and saying, worship it. It's an interesting scam. Well, McChesney, Picard, and others have said, let's go back to the founding fathers. Let's have public subsidy for free, independent, vibrant press. There are many ways to do this. Lots of specific proposals have been pointed out, been developed. It's just like the climate crisis. We know measures that can be taken to revive journalism from its current very low period, just as we know feasible measures to deal with the environmental crisis. The measures are there, the opportunities are there. What's required is the will and commitment to grasp them. And then we can deal with the problems, move on to a much better world, move on to pursue the goals that you brought up before of a free society that recognizes basic, essential human rights.
Yeah, it's wonderful the way you sum that up. Now this one is for you, Dan Broudy. In the face of an unprecedented wave of automation, is it worthwhile to rouse and inspire citizens through the idea that our struggle isn't about left and right, but between we the people and a corportocracy that's serving an ever smaller handful of billionaires?
That's a great question. I think if the future is to include human beings, sovereign creatures, agents of free will and bodily autonomy, fully informed by the necessity of ethical and moral imperatives, then it's pivotal to secure the future by arousing in citizens a deeper awareness of their own humanity. I think the simulacrum has worked to destroy our ethical sensibilities, our sense of who we are as sovereign creatures, so that we reflexively obey the messaging selling us each day the false virtues of mindless mass consumption. We're in a war for our minds, truly. As Noam once said, left and right are just really two sides of the same coin. And he called that the war party. And this party, it's deeply involved in the corporate theater, the production of what we would call news that seeks to capture the mind. The party is involved in a war against humanity. And there's a kind of an interesting white paper that seems to have been flushed down the memory hole, published precisely 1 year before the events of 9/11/2001. You might recall the Project for the New American Century. So on September 11th, 2000, is an interesting section that specifies how new wars will be waged in the future in areas of psychology, the importance of winning the hearts and minds of people in cyberspace. So automation is not just for the machines we come into contact with, but also in our thinking. Automation is meant for our thinking as well. Thought must be made to reflect automation for the automatons first, for work, to prepare them for work in the forthcoming Fourth Industrial Revolution, as it's often referred to. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, oftentimes when my colleagues and I talk about it, some of the connotations associated with it, they come from those who frequent the World Economic Forum. One of the more salient points that have been made by, for example, I think it was Klaus Schwab in one of his more recent books, who outlined the new world that is unfolding. We see this new opportunity with the pandemic, as it were, to recreate this new world, this new global digital economy. Of course, another point that is cited is the wish to blur the lines between the social self, the biological self, and the digital self, which is interesting, puzzling, and strange, I think, to many people. So the question often arises, who knew we had a digital self? It's an interesting subject of how humans are being conditioned to accept these new concepts of what it means to be a citizen with sovereign rights or civil rights. So a lot of my colleagues who look at this sort of literature, this public relations messaging, latch upon these key points that people in power are making about how they conceive of what it means to be a citizen, and how we are being nudged toward this new concept of what it means to be these things in the coming digital age. So the public relations messaging that we're reading is constantly conditioning us to accept as inevitable this new kind of reality, which many see as a techno-dystopian feudalism.
And what are your thoughts, Dan McQuillan? Rather than a laser beam focus on left and right, would it be more productive for citizens to consider the struggle between the powerful and the powerless?
I definitely believe in trying to inspire and mobilize people as much as possible. I do think this is a really interesting time that we live in, because it's very clear that lots of things that have been quite naturalized and assumed to be the background of the way we come to approach the world are falling apart. So that includes, I think, the easy distinctions between left and right that people have relied on for decades. It also includes the general system of the world. I mean, I think that you've capitalism, yes, and then neoliberalism really is the global system that we're living in. I would say that's why that's a name, a useful label for it. That's clearly falling apart under the pressure of its own ability to generate what some people call a polycrisis. We've got many crises going on at the same time: environmental crisis, pandemic, financial crisis. So I think a polycrisis is quite a good term for it. So under those conditions, lots of old certainties are definitely falling apart, and we need to actually reconstruct our positions on the world at the same time as actually trying to change it. So I don't think the simplistic ideas of left and right are, as if they were ever that functional, are as helpful as they were. In fact, it's very important, and this is where the technology comes in as well, to understand that things are sort of flowing and reshaping quite dynamically, and that you can't simply understand it by imposing templates from the past, whether that's 10 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago, that we need to be able to be a bit more agile in our understanding. However, I think there's also a massive danger in the idea that it's an idea I agree with, that there is in fact an extremely powerful and wealthy elite, and then the massive proportion of humanity, not just obviously people in the West who are simply, have no control over their own lives and who are increasingly precarious, but basically the large majority of the world's population who've more or less inhabited that space more or less since they were encountered by empire. So, absolutely there is this very stark distinction, and it's a mark of our current world system. But a politics that tries to position that as the people versus the elite is essentially very open to, isn't necessarily this, but it's very open to a kind of populism. I mean, it's more or less a definition of populism, actually, that there is this distinct thing, the people, which we can counterpose to the elite. The problem with that, of course, like any other neat distinction, is that that distinction has to have boundaries. And there are also boundaries of people who are not us, who are not part of us, are somehow not accepted or not, qualify in some way as being of the people. And that is clearly an opening to right-wing politics. That's would always be a danger with that narrative, I think, but it's very much a danger right now because, of course, right-wing politics is fantastically on the right. I don't mean that in a good way. I mean, it's hugely, incredibly rapidly developing, way beyond what most of us really would like to consider. If I open the news article, in a morning in the UK and I see the latest legislation that's introduced in relation to civil disobedience or in relation to refugees and asylum seekers, we're clearly in major parts of Europe living in very closely pre-fascistic times. So we need to be very, very alert, in our political ideas or also in our adoptions of technologies as to whether they have within them any latent tendencies towards this pathway to an increasingly right-wing or conspiracist politics. And both of those things, both political positions and also the technologies themselves. It's, again, another thing that I try to write about and try to raise the alarm about, that quite a lot of the technologies that are considered to be the most advanced and superior forms of advanced computation that we have right now actually have latent within them a kind of embodied politics which very much leans towards exclusionary social arrangements up to and including eliminationism, up to and including eugenics. So these are very, very dynamic times. They require a lot of agility and close attention, but they also present us with extreme dangers, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Raised awareness seems vital. Thinking in terms of next steps, what action can we take to move towards a healthier future?
Where I got to myself in terms of trying to construct a starting point for technological development or redevelopment or modification, or in some cases abolition. I suppose abolitionism may be a term familiar to some people who are listening to this, in which case it's useful to point out that abolitionism is not really about just saying that we want to shut this thing down or stop this thing or close this thing. It's very much predicated on the idea that a refusal is at the same time a call for an alternative set of arrangements. So I'm saying, well, where could we start? And I think I'm arguing for essentially a prefigurative technopolitics, so a way of doing things that tries to, as much as possible, in the framework of collective decision making about what technology should be developed and why they should be developed and what they should do and what characteristics they shouldn't have, that's prefigurative in the sense that it starts from being directly democratic. It starts from being based on relations of mutual aid and solidarity. So I try to promote the idea of assemblies, councils, community organizations. I try to propose that those technological developments can't be separate from the other things that people are pushing for, are campaigning for. So the idea of what is a future technics can't be something that's decided, again, coming right back to the beginning of our conversation. It isn't decided separately from the other things that people need to happen, the other questions that are urgent for people, whether that's the freedom from domestic abuse or the need to do something about homelessness or whatever it is. I mean, we need a technics that is a part of social movements and is where the development of that technics has a democratic element. Now, the good thing about that is it's not relying on somebody like me to generate those ideas from scratch, because we have some good history about what to do with this. I mean, I quoted the Lucas plan, which I think is a really outstanding example, but there are much broader ideas. I would look back to people like Ivan Illich and the idea of convivial technology, where he has both a very strong line on constraint, but it basically has a methodology for the examination of the technologies to try to preempt those forms of technology that would likely to cause harm at scale. But at the same time, a set of positive values about, not exactly a checklist, but almost a set of values about what kinds of technologies are likely to encourage, forms of community, which are then likely to encourage better forms of technology. So those would include, elements of least dependency on outside determination. So technology, tools that people themselves can use, tools that people themselves can take apart, reassemble, adapt, repair, and tools that have space for creativity, space for collective redeployment. So again, a very general set of principles, but I think a really good guideline for the kind of activities that people might want to engage in. I mean, I think where all of this starts in the moment is probably in the workplace, because that is where the immediate influence on what's getting developed and deployed comes, whether it's the people in the workplace are actually developing this stuff. You have had a rise in sort of consciousness by a wing of people who work in tech that actually they may be participating in the development of systems that are going to support extremely despotic forms of governance and regime. So people are a bit alert to that now, or the people who are already subjected to them. The workers in the Amazon warehouse are already have a lot of critical learning about, what's the problem with, yes, automated, but also automatizing systems. So definitely the workplace is a starting point, but another positive historical development that we don't have to kind of reinvent from scratch, again from the 1970s in the UK, was this idea of social production. So it's where the this question of production and social production, this idea of community needs and industrial needs, of how to combine them. And a very practical example, actually, which I didn't include in the book, is just something I stumbled on. One of the occupied factories from the financial collapse in Greece, this would be about 2010, 2011. There was a factory which was being closed down because of the financial crash, which in Greece was extremely intense, and the workers were going to be thrown out. The factory was going to be shut down. They occupied the factory, decided to keep the production going so they could sustain themselves and therefore their families. But what they're producing was, I can't remember now, but I think it was kind of rubber products or rubber tires, something like that. And what they did was throw the doors of the factory open to the local community and say, we've taken over this space. I mean, of course, they lived in the local community, so that's not a separate thing, but they invited the local community as a whole to be part of assemblies in the factory and say, well, we've taken this over. We want, we need to run it because we need to earn a living, but we want to do this in a way that has everybody's voices involved. And basically what they did was convert it into producing soap and detergent and cleaner, because the community was saying, well, this factory has always been a sore on the community because what it produces is toxic fumes, and the products go to the other side of the world and not any relevance or use here. But through a process of them, of exploration of what else could we do, what do we have the tools for, what this is the machinery left behind good for, they managed to generate an alternative. So I guess probably a lot of what I'm saying would come across as slightly hand-wavy abstract ideas, and I'm trying to give it some concrete instances here to just put the picture in people's minds. These things are not a distant process that we have to sort of climb slowly towards. Actually, these are immediate possibilities, under the right conditions. But obviously, that involve an element of contestation, but also definitely involve an element of self-organization.
The ever-elusive goal of self-organization. We'd like to share a quote now from artificial intelligence expert Neil Jacobson. He wrote that technologies may eventually permit people to not need jobs to have a high standard of living. The emphasis will be less on making money and more on making contributions, or at least creating an interesting life. Professor Chomsky, what do you make of Jacobson's vision?
That's paraphrasing John Maynard Keynes a century ago. This is long before AI, but just looking at the nature of productive capacity, he pointed out that by the time he thought of his grandchildren, that would be now, there would be enough productive capacity if it were intelligently and decently run for people to have almost full-time leisure time just to devote to creative work, their own interests, leisure, and so on. In fact, maybe we could go back to what was about 95% of human history. Of course, we don't want hunter-gatherer societies. We don't want to go back to those societies, of course. But there was one feature of them that we might want to go back to. The fact that they did almost no work, maybe 15 hours of work a week, as anthropologists have shown. As Keynes pointed out, we should have the capacity for that. AI might accelerate it somewhat. We should beware of the hype and look at the facts. But AI is very far from having anything like that capacity, but it might contribute to it. These are possibilities that do exist, even with our normal productive capacity, if it is handled properly. Of course, that was a condition that Keynes assumed a century ago when he was writing about this.
When you say handled properly, what does that mean?
That entails production for use, not for profit, and democratically controlled by participants in the community, whether it's a workplace or a town or whatever else.
Dan McQuillan, what are your thoughts on a vision that prioritizes contribution over money?
Well, sign me up in some ways. I'd like not to have a job. I mean, if my employer is listening to this, of course, I'm very happy to be working in my job at the moment, but I really would like to not have one, and everybody else not to have one, and us to live much more sort of, flexible and creative lives. And I think that's a possibility. I do. I think there is enough. We have enough to hand to be able to reorient things that way. But of course, that's not going to happen easily. It's not going to happen without resistance. What I would say about that particular vision is I would never argue in favor of jobs per se, because I think jobs are a very particular kind of arrangement of a way of doing work. But what I'm a bit concerned about is the idea that, which I think is a bit implicit in the quote that you mentioned, a kind of aspiration that these particular technology developments we have right now are leading us to a world of such generous productivity that then our social questions will simply be about, what to do with all this surplus. And I think that's actually quite dangerous in a couple of ways. Firstly, I think the technology that we're currently developing is not really very productive at all. It's mostly quite destructive. I mean, even the massive computational infrastructure we have, I think, is usually cited as one of the factors that's going to get us out of the climate crisis. I would say is entirely the opposite, actually. It's one of the structures that's going to lead us irrevocably deeper into a climate crisis. So what I'm trying to say there is for us all to be very wary, and a bit the same, I was kind of decrying the possibility of populism. What I try to alert people here for is this idea of accelerationism, this idea that while we may think that we're arguing for a transformed system, the way to get there is not to put our shoulders behind things that are currently happening and push it as hard as we can, because it's going to produce this wonderful surplus luxury communism, as somebody called it. It really isn't going to do that. It's going to just simply intensify immiseration while creating more of the same toxic conditions that we're already inhabiting. So while I do believe there are ways of arranging things socially with the support of technologies, with the support of a more liberatory techniques, that actually we don't experience lives as what other people might describe as wage slavery. We don't experience our lives as our own control over the means of production completely passed to somebody else's control, and our lives are very ordered by forces outside of our own influence. I think it's very possible to do things differently in a way that, as Illich would say, is more convivial. I mean, that vision of a society that I think is being invoked there is also an old vision. It goes back to people like Fourier, and his ideas that you can, of the phalanstery, I think he called them, where, you have a society where people find, if you like, their own niche. If you have a peculiar interest in this particular area, that's what you go and do, because that's your speciality, that's your passion, and that the passions, if you like, can be arranged in a structure that actually turns out to be reproductive of society. So yes, absolutely, there is a possibility for us not to have to think about our lives divided in this way between work and the little bit that's left over for us to live in. But I don't think it's going to come through an acceleration of the technologies that we have right now.
So I think we can agree that technology isn't exactly a Willy Wonka golden ticket to a bright future. Maybe we should bring personal responsibility into the picture. Dan Broudy, if we as individuals are to participate in a robust democracy, what faculties do we need to develop?
From my father's side of the family, we come from a long line of rabbis, and my mother's side, Irish Catholics. So in the family, there was always this presence of a strong spirit of to do right. My father was fond of saying that truth is the only way to live and die. And the principle of truth and obedience to its demands is the most valuable aspect of being human. And if there is no truth, no honesty, no openness before God and before his beloved creation, human beings, then we have really nothing. What's fundamental, in my humble opinion, is banishing from our consciousness all channels of lying and deceit. We could begin by, taking hold of our TVs, dragging them into the backyard and setting them alight, putting an end to our own self-inflicted misery, compounded by daily doses of corporate propaganda. The distractions that are offered by the TV principally and the radio, internet, other more popular vehicles of entertainment are really the key drivers behind the disintegration of critical awareness of the empirical world. I think if each person can divorce himself or herself from the system that Ed Herman and Noam identified in 1988, the one that inculcates the correct beliefs, values, and codes of behavior, the one that integrates us into the institutional structures of a larger society, we can begin to salvage a more realistic view of what it means to be human. I think when we can achieve this, we can achieve a more ideal political state, not given into the seductive forces of corruption. I think in some ways, our engagement with democratic decision-making, it's been spurred along in recent months by the bizarre narratives about COVID-19 and how this so-called insurmountable menace continues to haunt humanity. The media system today, it disallows dialogue. So democracy cannot possibly exist in this state. It cannot thrive in a culture constantly at war with logic and empirical science. Visually attractive corporate shills in the mainstream are trained to bound debate with acceptable parameters of thought and speech. And a complete separation from the source of our anxieties, from the sources of hysteria, I think that's needed.
And Professor Chomsky, what's essential to develop personally to promote democracy?
Freedom. First thing is freedom. We don't have that. Our system is designed so that for the large majority of the population, their waking lives are mostly spent in a totalitarian atmosphere where they are subject to the rule of an absolute master with power well beyond what Stalin ever dreamed of. Stalin couldn't tell you you're allowed to go to the bathroom for 5 minutes at 3 o'clock. You have to walk on this path, not that path. If you have to pick up a package at an Amazon warehouse, here are the clothes you have to wear. That's people's waking lives. It's called having a job, subordinating yourself to a master for most of your waking lives. Again, Adam Smith talked about this. He's known for his nice comments about division of labor, but less known for his sharp critique of division of labor, which he said will turn people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a human being can be, and by simply giving them routinized work under command by others. And therefore, in any civilized society, that has to be prevented by community action, state intervention for decent education, education for creativity, not obedience and subordination. Exactly the opposite of what we've been subjected to in the last 40 years of bitter, one-sided class war, misnamed neoliberalism. So yes, we know what has to be done. It was known a couple hundred years ago. You look at John Stuart Mill, one of the last of the great classical liberals. Take a look at his book on liberty. Look at the epigram. It's borrowed from Wilhelm von Humboldt, great humanist, great linguist, founder of classical liberalism, creator of the modern research university. Mill quoted his words, which said that I can't say it as nicely as he did, he said the goal of this book on liberty is to ensure the maximal flourishing of each individual's creative potential without controls from the outside, without improper constraints. That's basically the essence of it. That's classical liberalism, which was smashed by the rise of capitalism. In fact, the inheritors of the classical liberal tradition are left-wing anarchists.
Professors Chomsky, McQuillan, and Broudy, thanks so much for being part of our journey into the maelstrom. We really appreciate everyone who subscribes to Catalista on Patreon, where contributors can access merch and bonus interviews. 2 Minutes to Midnight, People Get Ready is proud to partner with Local Futures, a non-profit organization that's a pioneer in the worldwide localization movement. Visit them at localfutures.org. and you can find the current schedule of Catalista podcasts and sign up for our weekly email at catalista.net. If you enjoyed 2 Minutes to Midnight, please add, comment, and like us on your favorite podcast platform. 2M2M was edited and mixed by Ben Sorokis. Sound design is by Darren Chorley. Our music is composed by John Askew. The executive producers are Chicky Munch and Binny Bunny Munch, with assistance from Ed Goldberg and Gerald Gerbil. This is Henry Coleman signing off from the studios at Catalista Centrale. See you next time.